The next excerpt, MetropolitanHierotheos talks about asceticism and God's energy and the process of purification, illumination, and deification. Here goes. The fathers of the church, who, as unerring teachers, give voice to the ethos of the church, recorded the truth that asceticism is man's journey from purification of the heart to illumination of the nous and participation in deification. Asceticism has to do with the three stages of the spiritual life. It is actually the participation in God's energy, in which a person shares according to the spiritual state in which he finds himself. If he is in the grip of passions and repents, the uncreated energy of God purifies him, and so is described as purifying. If he is in a state of illumination, divine grace illuminates him and is referred to as illuminating. If he is in the state of deification, it strengthens and increases him in the state and is called deifying or perfecting. It is clear that the names given to God's energy vary according to its results, since the energy itself is something different from the effect it produces. So I want to make a comment. So we've just heard that if you're going to go through those three stages, purification, for example, well, has to be with God's energy. Some people might do a kind of pseudo purification without God's energy, and that would be pretty vain. Similarly, with illumination, you might know stuff, but if you know it without God's energy, well, you're going to be very proud. And finally, deification, if that's not with God's energy, well, you're absolutely in delusion. But it was interesting to call that MetropolitanHierotheos called it a strengthening and an increasing and a perfecting. So that can kind of give the lie to the misperception that, deification, glorification is something which is a kind of one-off in the future. That no, actually it is a process and it is a participation, and there will be degrees of participation in that. So that would suggest that even a tiny bit of deification, might be the measure. Who knows? Right, the next excerpt, we go back to talk about something that that was mentioned earlier, but that's Neoplatonism, and it's worth having a bit more detail about this. Now, this is quite a long segment, all about Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is a philosophical system that evolved between the 2nd and 6th centuries of the Christian era as an attempt by certain idolatrous philosophers to revive Platonism. In fact, it is a development and transformation of Platonism in accordance with the needs of the age. It is the last philosophical movement of the classical Greek world. As would be expected, Neoplatonism was subject to influences, either negative or positive, from Christianity, Gnosticism, and the Eastern religions, to the point that there is talk of the orientalization of Platonic thought, and he gives some footnotes there. Neoplatonism first appeared in Alexandria with Ammonius Saccas, who came of Christian parents, returned to paganism, and taught Neoplatonism around 209 AD. So that was Ammonius Saccas. The main representative of Neoplatonism, however, was Plotinus, who was a disciple of Ammonius, and brought this system to Rome. The view and life of Plotinus were preserved for us by Porphyry, as well as by Porphyry's disciple Iamblichus. Many schools are recorded as teaching and developing Neoplatonism, and although these schools have something in common, there are also differences. There was the Neoplatonic school of Rome, of which the chief exponents were Plotinus and Porphyry. There was the Neoplatonic school of Syria, of which the main representative was Iamblichus. There was the Neoplatonic school of Athens, of which Proclus was the exponent, and there was the Neoplatonic school of Alexandria. The fundamental theory of Plotinus and the later Neoplatonists is the teaching that beings and the world were created through emanation. That's with an E, emanation. Plotinus poses two basic questions. The first is, where do beings come from? Which relates to his ontology and cosmology. And the second is, where to? Which relates to his ethics. With regard to the first question, where do beings come from? Plotinus and the later Neoplatonists upheld the theory that there is a procession or effulgence from the one towards the many. One was capitalized there. The supreme principle from which all things have originated is the capital O one. After that comes the nous, which is the center of ideas. This nous originated by emanation, with an E, from the one, constitutes the image and outpouring of the one, and is interwoven with it. Both the one and the nous are hypostases, subsistent entities. From the nous, there emanated the soul, which has the powers within it to give shape to the world, perceptible to the senses. When the soul is mentioned, it means, on the one hand, the soul of the perceptible world, the world soul, and on the other, man's soul. The one, the nous, and the soul make up three hypostases. The last element in this descent is matter. The three hypostases, so matter is the fourth thing there. The three hypostases were mentioned, thus three hypostases were mentioned: the one, which is the principle of the creation of the universe; the nous, which is the seat of all ideas, of the general archetypes for the creation of the different categories of beings perceptible to the senses; and the soul, which is the seat of those powers which shape the perceptible world, based on the specifications of the ideas of the nous. Another fundamental notion of Plotinus's is another trinity that actually relates to three basic stages of the three hypostases, namely abiding, according to which each hypostasis is concentrated within itself; outgoing, which is the stage when a hypostasis has reached its fullness and emits a superabundance so that another lower hypostasis can be created; and return, which is the attempt of each hypostasis to return to the source from which it came forth. I'm going to pause just to footnote that outgoing thing that Meister Eckhart, that maniac of the High Middle Ages, called this ebullience. It's a hideous idea that infects Roman Catholic thought, to do with the nature of the Lord. Carry on. Thus, there are two contrary powers within these hypostases: one that moves towards creation, and the other that returns to the cause by which it was created. As for the second question, where to, the basic teaching of Neoplatonism is Plato's view that the soul has been fettered by the body, and the body is the prison of the soul, which means that man's salvation is the release of the soul from the body and its return to the world of ideas. The Neoplatonists, particularly Porphyry, under the influence of Plotinus, spoke about two kinds of death: physical death, which is the release of the soul from the body, but also philosophical death, which is the release of the soul from the body prior to physical death by means of theurgy, which consists of rites of mystagogy and magic. There is a difference between theology and theurgy. The former, theology, is concerned with the interpretation of the names and nature of the gods, which means that this so-called theology is identical with philosophy. Whereas the latter, theurgy, is concerned with the experience of man's union with the gods through the use of magical objects. The Neoplatonic school of Syria in particular made much use of theurgy and sought the return of the soul to the divine by means of various magical rites. Porphyry tells us about what happened when Olympius of Alexandria, a disciple of Ammonius, was jealous of Plotinus and attempted through magic to hurt him with astral powers. While he was attempting to do this, he realized that he had done harm to himself. And he told his acquaintances that the soul of Plotinus was so great that it could not only repulse attacks, but even direct them back against those attempting to harm him. He refers to the occasion when an Egyptian priest went to Rome and, wishing to prove his wisdom, invited Plotinus to be present at the invocation of one of his familiar demons. However, when the Egyptian priest carried out the invocation, it was not a demon that appeared, but a god. At which point the Egyptian said to Plotinus, "Blessed are you who have a god for a demon, and not an associate from the subservient race." In other words, he had a more powerful and greater demon god. Porphyry writes that Plotinus, having as a companion one of those demons most like a god, always had his divine eye turned towards him. The teaching of Neoplatonism exercised a great influence on the theology of St. Augustine. And there is a footnote to this. It's the Hesychia And Theology, and that is the Religious and Ethical Encyclopedia, Volume 10, of Christos Androutsos, in the Lexicon Philosophios, Dictionary of Philosophy. Anyway, carry on. There are some who assert that the Church's neptic teaching, as expressed by St. Dionysius the Areopagite, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Simeon the New Theologian, St. Gregory Palamas and others, was influenced by the teaching of Neoplatonism. They do this on the grounds that the vocabulary is the same in both cases, with regard both to theology and soteriology. Things are not, however, as straightforward as they seem at first glance. The three hypostases of Neoplatonism, one, nous, soul, have no connection at all with the triune God of the Christian Church as expressed by the Holy Fathers. This is because in Orthodox theology we do not accept metaphysics and the principle of idealism. Furthermore, it is noticeable that a shared vocabulary exists for man's attempt to be united with God. This consists of such terms as nous, soul, salvation of the soul, purification, ecstasy, illumination, and so on. If, however, we look at the meanings these terms have in Neoplatonic teaching and compare them with the meanings they have in the theology of the Church, then we can understand that the gulf that exists between Neoplatonism and the Orthodox neptic theology of the Church. Let us give a few typical examples. Just before we do that, if you're going to read St. Dionysius the Areopagite in the terrible translations in English that exist, those Oxbridge scholars were Orthodox Christians, who knows what they were, and they absolutely didn't understand. And Father Andrew Louth, I think, falls into that same academic error of considering St. Dionysius the Areopagite as a Neoplatonist. I think Bishop Alexander Golitsyn provided a good corrective to that idea that St. Dionysius the Areopagite was a Neoplatonist. But he himself, Bishop Alexander Golitsyn, brought in a kind of different idea, which is quite idiosyncratic of his own. Anyway, we'll carry on. The nous, according to Plotinus, is the hypostasis which came forth from the One by emanation. It constitutes an image of the One, and as an outpouring of the One, it is continually intertwined with it. It is the seat of the ideas, and these ideas are the archetypes through which the different categories of perceptible beings were created. The nous, through its overflowing essence, which emanates from it, creates the soul. This nous, together with its timeless ideas, exists in eternity. According to Orthodox theology, by contrast, the nous is a faculty of the soul. It is the eye of the soul, man's most profound attention. The nous, like the soul, of which it is a faculty, is created. It is not the seat of the ideas, because, according to Orthodox theology, the world of ideas does not exist. The term nous is used to describe the Father, who is consubstantial with the other persons of the Holy Trinity. So he's saying that Plotinus's idea might be closer to the Christian idea of Father in the Holy Trinity. But that point didn't need to be made. It's pretty meaningless. Don't worry about it. The soul, according to Plotinus, derives from the nous. Whereas the nous exists in eternity, the soul acts within the corrupting flow of time, within which the perceptible world exists, and by which, even though it is a creation of its own powers, it is in danger of being swept away to death. The soul, through its power it possesses, gives shape, in accordance with the specification of the ideas of the nous, to the world, such that the formless matter of the world is changed into beings perceptible to the senses. Plotinus separated man's soul into two levels: the higher soul, which is limited exclusively to the soul's rational function, and the lower soul, which is a kind of embodied soul that acts in the body. Porphyry, by contrast, instead of dividing the soul into higher and lower parts, divided it into essence and energy. What is more, Proclus, the chief exponent of the Neoplatonic school at Athens, separated the soul into three levels: divine, demonic, and human. According to Orthodox theology, the soul is God's creation. It did not exist before the body was created. It exists together with the body. It does not shape the perceptible world. It is not separated into higher and lower parts, and the division of the soul into essence and energy has not the slightest connection with the claims of Neoplatonism, which are also linked with ecstasy, as we shall see later on. And MetropolitanHierotheos is talking about the Orthodox understanding of essence and energy there, not having the slightest connection with the claims of Neoplatonism. Carry on. The salvation of the soul, according to Neoplatonism, which on this point too agrees with Plato's theory, is the release of the soul, which by nature is immortal, from the body, which by nature is mortal, and its return to the world of ideas. Plotinus said that the soul's salvation is its release from the body because, as long as it remains in the body, it is likely to be in the grip of arrogance. it is necessary for the soul to return to its originator, the nous, and then for the nous to return to the one, the principle of creation. Man must find the lower part of his soul, which by reason of its arrogance has become identified with the body, so that he can return by way of the nous to the one. The union of the soul with the one is achieved in a purely mystical way, in the sense that it is something which the soul experiences without being in a position to describe it. The soul achieves this on its own without anyone's help, but just through its asceticism. Many Neoplatonic schools, however, made use of theurgy, in other words, divination, rituals, and magic, in order to achieve this union with the One. What Neoplatonism says about the salvation of the soul bears no relation at all to the Church's theology on the salvation of the soul. The soul's salvation does not mean release from the body, but it's release from the carnal mind and the communion of the whole person with God. Salvation is when the soul receives the grace of God, and through it grace is transmitted to the body, so that we speak of the salvation of the whole man. The purification of man according to Neoplatonism is a method, a phase in the soul's release from the body and its mystical union and identification with the One. Plotinus asks, by what means? How will anyone see beauty without a mechanism? This is achieved through asceticism, purification, dialectic, intense longing, ecstasy, the inebriation of vision, life without sensual pleasure, and finally mystical union and identification with the good, likeness with God. Purification is defined as separation from things perceived by the senses and exaltation through the virtues. It is deliverance from the defilements of matter. According to Iamblikos, a disciple of Porphyry and the principal exponent of the Neoplatonic school of Syria, purification consists in the soul's release from fate, its return to the intelligible world, and by extension in its union with God. According to Orthodox theology, purification has nothing to do with the soul's release from the body and the world, but is associated with the transformation of man's psychosomatic powers, so that they proceed according to nature and above nature, and with the release of the soul and the body from the worldly and carnal mind. Ecstasy, according to Porphyry, means going beyond the lower part of the soul and dwelling in the higher part of the soul, overcoming or abandoning the body, which is achieved through inner obedience to the intelligible function of the upper part of the soul. The soul's release from the body, which is referred to as philosophical death, whereas the body's release from the soul is physical death, sinking into the abyss of being. Porphyry and Iamblikos also concerned themselves with what is known as theurgy, which on the one hand was regarded as a sort of magic, but on the other as a system of divination. There were two basic forms of theurgy: the mystical form of theurgy, which was practiced through the world of inanimate objects, animals, and plants, and the spiritual form of theurgy, which was accomplished with representatives of the human race. According to the Orthodox neptic theology of the Church, by contrast, ecstasy is not the departure of the nous from the body, but the return through grace of the nous to the heart and the body, and its ascent in this manner to God. Footnote, we heard about this definition of ecstasy from MetropolitanHierotheos earlier. Carry on. Ecstasy is when the nous prays noetically, while the reason is conscious of the perceptible world and does not lose touch with it. Of course, ecstasy in the neptic tradition of the Church is the advent of divine grace in man and has nothing to do with the action of demons, as there is a clear distinction between the vision of God and demonic affliction, between created and uncreated energies. The illumination of the nous and enlightenment according to Platonism and Neoplatonism is the knowledge of the archetypes of beings when the soul returns to the world of ideas from which it originated. In the neptic theology of the Church, however, illumination and enlightenment of the nous denote that state in which continuous noetic prayer of the heart develops within the nous by the action of divine grace, after the nous has been purified and freed from the effect of sensual pleasure and pain, from the worldly and carnal mind. Prayer of the heart comes about through the noetic faculty, while the rational faculty does not lose touch with its surroundings or awareness of them. Thus, illumination and enlightenment of the nous is its release from the passions, reason, and the surrounding world of the senses and perceptible objects, according to the analysis made by Father John Romanides of blessed memory. St. Maximus the Confessor was concerned with these issues, so we shall proceed to look at his teaching on these stages in the spiritual life. First of all, St. Maximus speaks repeatedly in his works about praxis, practice, and theoria, as well as about the practical person and the person who has experienced theoria. In general terms, praxis is the struggle to purify the heart from passions, and theoria is prayer in man's mystical relationship with God. According to St. Maximus, the practical person who keeps Christ's commandments is a herdsman of the nous, because moral achievements can be represented by cattle, whereas the man with spiritual knowledge is a shepherd of sheep, because thoughts are like the sheep pastured by the nous on the mountains of vision. Elsewhere, he makes a distinction between states of praxis, theoria, and theology, theologia, and teaches that the nous, which succeeds in practice, that is war with the passions, practice of the virtues, advances in prudence. In other words, in the discrimination between virtue and vice. The nous which attains to theoria, noetic prayer, advances in spiritual knowledge, that is to say, to the inequalities of incorporeal and corporeal things, to the knowledge of the logi, or logi, principles of beings. Then, having passed the preceding stages, it is granted the grace of theology, and resting in God through the Holy Spirit, it discerns, as far as this is possible for the human nous, the qualities of God. In many places in his writings, we encountered the distinction between practical philosophy, natural theoria, or simply theoria, and initiation into theoria. And this initiation is designated by various terms, such as philosophy of theoria, epiphatic theology, Gnostic theology by means of theoria, commenting on Christ's words, "Verily I say unto you, that there be some of them that stand here which shall not taste death till they have seen the kingdom of God," Mark 9:1. And speaking about death, he says that the deadening of the passions is also called death. When the practical man who is dead to the passions attains to natural theoria, he has died with regard to his former state. However, the person who has passed through natural theoria, and having abandoned all causes, has attained to the cause of all things by the apophatic method of theology, is also dead with regard to his former state, since he does not move among created things, but has transferred his activity to the maker of all things. This means that the movement from practical philosophy to natural theoria is a sort of death which constitutes another stage of the spiritual life, and the transition from natural theoria to apophatic theology, the initiation into theological mysteries, is another death. Elsewhere in his teaching, he links the Christian spiritual progress with Christ's incarnation. Someone who is manfully engaged in the holy warfare of practical philosophy has Christ nearby, who came from the Father into the world. In other words, he keeps company with the incarnate Word of God, as did the disciples before Christ's passion. But when someone is declared victor in the fight against the passions and the demons, is released from the struggles of praxis against the passions, has passed to theoria, and thence has attained to Gnostic philosophy, he shares with just pause, knowing philosophy, nothing to do with Gnosticism. He shares with the heresy of Gnosticism, he shares with the Word his experience of resurrection and ascension, capital R, capital A, when he leaves the world and makes his way back to his Father. When he speaks about returning to the Father, he means that state of the nous which transcends the world and is free from all material propensity, when the Word of God enters into us, putting an end to our battle with the passions and the demons. Analysing the inscription written in Latin, Greek and Hebrew letters that was placed on the cross of Christ, he says it shows that Christ is the King and Lord of practical, natural, and theological philosophy. The Latin writing signifies practical theology because the Roman Empire was the most manful of all the kingdoms of the earth, for the distinguishing feature of practical philosophy is manfulness. The Greek writing signifies natural philosophy, since the Greek nation, more than any other people, has pursued natural philosophy. And the Hebrew writing signifies initiation into the mysteries of theology, since the Hebrew nation from the beginning consecrated its fathers to God. In other words, it had prophets who had communion and union with God. Of course, these degrees of the spiritual state of spiritual life, according to St. Maximus, are not permanent states, because it is possible for someone to return to an earlier state if he does not pay attention to his spiritual path. Because the nous of every true philosopher and Gnostic, again nothing to do with the heresy of Gnosticism, possesses both Judah and Jerusalem. It has Judah as practical philosophy and Jerusalem as initiation into theoria. Whenever, by the grace of God, someone wins a victory over the passions, yet does not thank God who gave him this gift, then with God's permission the shameful passions rise up in revolt and sully his conscience, which until then was pure. Okay, going to switch to a different author. The teaching of St. Nikitas Stithatos on the degrees of purification, illumination, and perfection. Through practical philosophy, man's heart is purified. Through natural theoria, he experiences illumination. And through initiation into the mystery of theology, he participates in theoria, in deification. That is why other holy fathers, as we have seen, speak about purification, illumination, and deification. Saint Nikitas Stithatos refers to God's purifying, illuminating, and deifying energy. We shall look at the teaching of Saint Nikitas on the subject of the spiritual life. There are 3 stages for those who progress in the spiritual life: the purifying, the illuminative, and the mystical, through which we are perfected. The practical stage pertains to beginners in the spiritual life, the illuminative to those who are midway, and the mystical to the perfect. It is through these 3 consecutive stages that we ascend, growing in stature according to Christ, and attaining natural manhood, the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Ephesians 4:13. Going on to analyse these 3 stages in detail, he says that the purifying stage is linked with ascetic practice, repentance, tears, the renunciation of the earthy man, and the mortification of unruly passions. The illuminative stage pertains to those who, after holy struggles, have attained to the first level of dispassion, which is characterized by the spiritual knowledge of created beings, the theoria of the inner essences, and communion in the Holy Spirit. This state is characterized by the purification of the nous, the noetic opening of the eyes, and the birth of the Word accompanied by sublime concepts of spiritual knowledge. The mystical and perfective stage pertains to the person who has come to the measure of the stature of Christ, beholds God in the vision of light, shares in the ineffable mysteries of God, has ascended to the 3rd heaven of theology, and goes on to become a minister of God's mysteries, a wise theologian within the Church. Conclusion. From what has been said, it is obvious that there is a difference between an ecumenical church and ecumenism. The Orthodox Church is ecumenical because it has spread through the world and has as its aim the salvation of people living all over the world and the hallowing of creation. The Orthodox Church is also called Catholic, lowercase c, precisely because it preserves the whole truth about God, man and creation, and seeks man's deification and creation's sanctification. Ecumenism is a notion expressed through many theories such as, for example, the branch theory, so-called baptismal theology, the theory of inclusiveness, and inter-Christian and interfaith syncretism. The spirit of ecumenism, however, is not expressed solely through these views, but also through the fact that members of the Orthodox Church and of the various confessions hold the same theological views on a range of dogmatic issues, and also that they represent the same way of life. I'm going to repeat because the phone seemed to idle. The spirit of ecumenism, however, is not expressed solely through these views, branch theory, baptismal theology, etc., but also through the fact that members of the Orthodox Church and of the various confessions hold the same theological views on a range of dogmatic issues, and also that they represent the same way of life. This sort of Christian syncretism, since they have actually removed the basic Orthodox teaching about purification, illumination, and deification from their lives. So that's a form of Orthodox syncretism, when Orthodox voices and those of various confessions start to focus on holding the same theological views on a range of dogmatic issues and holding that they represent the same ways of life. Carry on. Such a spirit of ecumenism can be observed in some Orthodox theologians who feel themselves to be members of the Orthodox Church and pride themselves on that, while at the same time they voice certain ecumenistic theological views originating from Western theologians and sometimes even from other religious traditions. In such cases, they have been influenced not just in the matter of theological terminology, but first and foremost with regard to the prerequisites for speaking about God in an orthodox way. What is more, this sort of ecumenistic spirit is also noticeable in certain monastic circles. They feel that they are monks of the Orthodox Church, but their monasticism has been influenced by Western monastic models and bears no relation to monasticism as lived and expressed by the fathers of the Church. So what are these Western models? Not so much the orders thing, but more the got to be socially useful, got to be militaristically organized, got to be urban, got to be in the service of the administration of the church, putting priests, putting monks, putting hieromonks into parishes, for example, might be an indicator of that. We'll carry on. When monasticism is activistic, limited merely to implementing external formalities and regulations, and disconnected from the hesychastic and neptic tradition, as portrayed with great clarity by St. John the Latter, St. Simeon the New Theologian, St. Gregory Palamas, and generally in the Philokalia of the Holy Neptic Fathers, as well as in the Cappadocian Fathers, then it expresses and lives the spirit of ecumenism. And another comment, perhaps the elaborate devotion to services and splendor and ritual and high perfection of musical performance or liturgical display might also be, MetropolitanHierotheos might also say, yeah, okay, this is a bit ecumenistic as well. Carry on. It follows that we ought not to look at ecumenism solely on the level of the words, which are the addresses and replies spoken during meetings between representatives of the various Christian confessions, but we should look before all else at the way in which theology and asceticism are expressed and lived. Now, this is an important point because many of the so-called true Orthodox will point to meetings, addresses and replies and call it ecumenicism. But MetropolitanHierotheos is talking about the way in which theology and asceticism are expressed and lived. Entitle one to talk from an Orthodox point of view, having undergone that process of purification, illumination, and deification. So I think that MetropolitanHierotheos would say that the so-called true Orthodox, so-called genuine, when they point to meetings and addresses and replies, those so-called true Orthodox, so-called genuine, are being ecumenistic, are being worldly, because they're not speaking from that base of purification, illumination, and deification, which is the ascetic practice of the Church. Carry on. If we are members of the Orthodox Church, whether as theologians, members of the clergy, monks, or lay people, and proud to be so, but we are animated by this sort of ecumenism with regard to praxis, then we have to doubt the authenticity of our Orthodox faith and life. In such circumstances, we are experiencing and expressing in praxis a sort of uniatism. We contend ourselves with the Orthodox way of celebrating the sacraments, ceremonial, but we have detached ourselves from Orthodox theology and life. Just participating in the sacraments of the Church is not enough, however, because we also have to meet the Orthodox preconditions for participating in them. What is more, Orthodox theology as expressed by the Fathers of the Church and the Orthodox Hesychastic tradition as expressed by Orthodox monks are not independent of the sacraments or of our Church. Comment, I thought that was interesting that he used the word uniatism, so nothing to do with the Uniate Church or any of that garbage, but I kind of get the sense of what he's getting at. Carry on. I think we ought to pay particular attention to the issue of how the spirit of ecumenism infiltrates into the life of our Church. Such ecumenism shows itself as a different theology and a different approach to asceticism from that taught and lived by our past and present fathers. We also need to be very careful lest, while we were against ecumenism, we are nonetheless living and expressing the spirit of ecumenism in practice. So, just before we leave this topic, we can say that heavy clericalism, heavy institutionalization, so-called, is it canonical or uncanonical? Is he canonical? Is he not canonical? And the displays of clericalism in splendid pomp and high emphasis on the administrative structure of the Church. I think MetropolitanHierotheos is saying, okay, well, that's expressing a kind of ecumenism and a sort of uniatism. Similarly, the calling out by the so-called true and genuine Orthodox against what they call quote unquote world orthodoxy can also be ecumenicist in spirit. Not only with its, the worldly combination of worldly displays, but also themselves. They can overemphasize the outer sacramental forms of their worship, whether it's Western Rite or whether it's who knows what. So I think that MetropolitanHierotheos is pointing to that central core practice of purification, illumination, and deification. And I think he's right to do so, because if someone was doing that, you probably would never hear of them. There'd be monastics living either in Canobia or in solitude, simply getting on with that. And when they did speak, you would certainly notice the spiritual authority that they might have when they do open their mouths and talk. Now we're jumping ahead to a different topic, and they're going to be using the word virtue, but I notice that MetropolitanHierotheos is kind of blurring virtue with grace, gifts sometimes. So it's, for me, I wish he had been a bit more explicit about separating those and defining those two terms differently, but never mind. Carry on. The perfect good is God, but in God there is certainly no end or limit. The person who pursues what is good actually participates in God. There is therefore no limit to virtue. St. Gregory of Nyssa writes explicitly, the one limit of virtue is the absence of a limit. And elsewhere, in the case of virtue, we have learned from the Apostle that its one limit of perfection is the fact that it has no limit. This is because there is no created standard against which virtue can be measured, as God himself, who is unlimited and infinite, is perfection, goodness, and virtue. It is moreover the nature of virtue and everything good to have no end, so anything marked off by boundaries is not virtue. Whoever participates in virtue participates in God, because he himself is perfect virtue. Since the divine nature has no limits or bounds, anything circumscribed by limits is not virtue, which means that virtue is continuous progress and development. I mean, a comment, the only way to really understand this is he's talking about grace, but probably the perception of it might be, the virtue might be used as the thing that is perceived rather than the thing that it is. Okay, carry on. Truth is not something abstract and unsubstantial. It has nothing to do with non-being or the imaginary concept of non-being, but is knowledge and awareness of what exists. The full knowledge of being comes about by purifying our opinion concerning non-being. When someone sees something that really exists, he immediately understands by experience the falsehood of what is imaginary, that is, actually non-being, and that so-called non-being has no existence but is a figment of the imagination. Defining truth, St. Gregory of Nyssa says that it is not to have a mistaken apprehension of being. Again, he says, truth is the sure apprehension of real being. Falsehood, by contrast, is an imaginary image of non-being produced in man's nous. Falsehood is a kind of impression which arises in the understanding about non-being, as though what does not exist does, in fact, exist. This definition of truth and falsehood is of supreme importance because it also shows us exactly what Orthodox theology is, which is inseparable from the truth. Truth is, capital B, being, capital E, existence, God, who appears to those whose hearts have been purified. Pause. So absolutely, truth is a perceptible thing, not an abstract, rational thing. Carry on. Falsehood, on the other hand, is non-being. It is unsubstantial and imaginary. When someone concocts a being, God, with his fantasy, or when he speculates about God using rational premises mixed with his fallen nature's faculty of imagination, he is living an existential lie. Comment. So, for example, abstract theologizing about the Trinity with triangles, monarchical principle pointing this way and that. I think MetropolitanHierotheos is saying this is imaginative, unsubstantial, and using the faculty of reason, and it's because of our fallen nature that we'll be doing that, and existentially we would be living a lie. Carry on. This is precisely why the fathers of the church regard heretics who theologize by means of imagination and conjecture as being in a state of existential falsehood. Another comment, it's good to be rationalistic, and it's good to use logic, and it's good to do correct metaphysics, but the orthodox approach is apophatic. You have to know when to stop and when it's failing, and so you have to say you might know many things are wrong, and you might not know what's right, but at least by ruling out all of the wrong things, you're leaving the door open for what is right. The opposite would be of apophasis is kataphasis, which is when you will make positive, realistic declarations about what is right, simply declaratively. Carry on. St. Gregory of Nyssa, using the example of a mirror, says that when someone shuns evil and is delivered from the snares of the evil one, he places a mirror in his soul. Then in the pure mirror of his soul, the images and impressions of virtue are revealed to him by God. We learn from this that theology is a revelation of God himself to the pure human heart. Anything that is connected with the imagination and reason and cut off from the orthodox ascetic method, which cleans the mirror of the heart, is false and unsubstantial. The speculative theologian therefore acts within the framework of idolatry. He does not theologize about him who is, but about some non-existent being that is a product of imagination and speculation. And this is the Roman Catholic method, to be speculative and to take into oneself an abstract image and start to work with that image in an imaginative way, and that gives us that second word of speculation, which is to reflect again, like in a house of mirrors, cogitating over and over in an abstract way. Whereas MetropolitanHierotheos is that if you cut yourself off from the orthodox ascetic method, which cleans the mirror of the heart, of course you're not only will the images in your heart be cloudy and murky, but if once you start speculating, you've actually thrown away the mirror, and you've just run away with the image, and you're building fantasies based on that image. Jumping ahead, in Orthodox theology, we do not accept conjectural analogy, according to which there is a correlation between the visible world and the world of archetypes and ideas, and the actual world perceptible to the senses as a copy of the world of ideas, as classical metaphysics believed. Orthodox theology is not metaphysical in that sense.